We had a couple of options. We decided that this might be a good first thing to talk about. I understand that there are some general physicians in the audience, but I hope it's still relevant, because what we're setting up for renal registries with ISN is actually based on documents and guidance for setting up registries in general. We've tailored it to be relevant for setting up renal registries, but I think the principles are very general and will apply to all specialties. So just a little bit of background. You'll all be aware of this, but I mean, registry data can be used to sort of improve awareness of the problem of kidney disease in a country, and be really powerful in persuading policymakers of the healthcare needs and the gaps when they're deciding on funding. And the other way around, when you've got registry data, this was certainly the case in the UK, it was very powerful for identifying areas of reduced access to treatment and planning of new dialysis units and services. And so it was a very powerful tool for service planning. And then within a country, but also at the ISN level, we use data a lot, whether it's from the Global Kidney Health Atlas, which is due to, the survey is running again next year for the third iteration. But even the Global Kidney Health Atlas relies a lot on the registry data to provide the numbers that we all use to lobby. And so back in 2016, we set up this pilot exercise with ISN to try and establish a resource that would be available to kidney health advocates in countries without renal registries, to help them to establish a renal registry that they could use the data then for advocacy, to quality assure the kidney care that's being delivered in their country, and also least importantly, but also often a draw for people setting up registries to do research. And initially we set this up with 5 large registries that are established and have a lot of credibility. So the European Registry, the Australia New Zealand Registry, the US Registry, the AFRAN Registry, which Professor Davids runs, and a number of you are actively involved in, based on the South African platform, and the South and Latin American Registry, which is phenomenally effective in setting up registries and advocacy. And this was originally for 2 years, and we had a couple of things that we were going to deliver in that time, but we got a presence on the ISN website, and we did a survey of registries around the world, looking at the data that they collected and the methods that they used. And we presented a couple of posters at the World Congress of Nephrology in 2019 in Melbourne, and wrote a paper at the bottom there in Kidney International, it's a Nephrology Sans Frontières piece, which summarizes the results of the pilot and the results of the survey. And we'll come back to the results of the survey in just a second. And we also ran our first workshop. So the first one was in Melbourne and was in person in the days when we could have in-person meetings. And we had great representation from around the world, but good representation from Africa. And it was a really, really good meeting. And in fact, we had the big chiefs from US RDS and ERA and ANSData giving really, really nice talks. But I think the best bit about it was the people in the country setting up the registries, sharing their experiences. I think that was the most inspiring thing for everybody, sitting around tables, brainstorming about the solutions that people had and sharing those solutions, because really those were the guys that were working in an environment most like each other, and so they had the most, I think, to learn from each other. We were meant to be having a similar workshop in person in Kuala Lumpur, in the Middle East, at WCN 2021, but that had to get pushed online. But we had a very good online conference as well, or webinar as well. And after that 2-year pilot, ISN decided to make this it's one of its permanent programs, and gave us we set up rather, we agreed a number of activities that we would do. And over a year or a year and a half, in discussions with ISN, it was possible to build this registry toolkit, this registry initiative, into the collaboration plan that ISN has with the WHO. So every couple of years, ISN agrees a collaboration plan with WHO with 5 or 6 deliverables. And then ISN goes away and works on those deliverables and then presents them to WHO at the end, and they can be badged as WHO activities and output. And we were really fortunate to be able to have the Share RR initiative written into that collaboration plan. And really the big part of that was to develop a toolkit that would support the establishment and the maintenance of renal registries. So there's a bundle of 4 things there, which we'll talk through over the next sort of 20, 30 minutes. But this is what we're planning to do to meet our requirements for the collaboration. And really, we were very fortunate to find these 2 very comprehensive, very systematic guidance documents that have been written on how to set up registries. So these are not renal registry guidance documents, these are general registry guidance documents. It's actually coming from a renal registry world where I'm very familiar with how renal registries are run in different countries. It's good to be reminded that there are many different models of registries, including device registries for surgical procedures and hips and that sort of thing, and valves, therapeutic registries for expensive drugs in multiple sclerosis and other things like that. And so our view of registries as kidney doctors is often based on the sort of very traditional model of a dialysis or a transplant registry. But these 2 big guidance documents take a much more general approach, and that's great to be drawn back to those first principles. But they're very meaty. And so nobody really, unless they were very dedicated, would work their way through the sort of 700 odd pages of those 2 guidance documents. But they formed a great basis for us to start writing our toolkit. And so we have based our toolkit on those 2 guidance documents. And it's been a little bit of a journey. On the call with me is Dr. Maria Pipias, who's a postdoc kidney doctor in Bristol. And she and I and some emerging leader program fellows from ISN have been working with the advisory group to write and then rewrite and get feedback and then rewrite again the toolkit. And the latest iteration, hot off the press, it sort of just was pinged out to the advisory group yesterday, now looks like this. So, and one of the great things about this call will be to hear what you guys think about this. How would it work in a country where perhaps you're thinking of setting up a registry? Is the structure useful? Are the steps useful? Because we now have this stepwise process that we think will work, which I'm going to talk you through in a moment. So first of all, considering feasibility and appropriateness. And I think people often want to rush into setting up a registry, and I think it's really important to pause and ask 3 questions of yourself and of your country before starting on the path of setting up a registry. And the first is whether, rather, what the health service or public health goal or objective that you're trying to achieve is. And I think for renal registries, it's often very simple. So we want to just report the numbers of people starting hemodialysis or peritoneal dialysis or having a kidney transplant. We might want to report on the survival on hemodialysis. For example, we might want to describe differences between different regions in terms of rates of treatment. those are treatment registers. They're treatment rates that we're describing. They're different from disease rates or disease prevalences, because of course not everybody with the disease, in this case kidney failure, might have access to the treatment. And so, so being really clear, is it the disease that you want to report, in which case you would need to capture everybody with kidney failure, or is it the treatment rate? And you might, so the CKDU kind of option, so kidney disease of unknown origin, you might feel that there's a concern in your country that there are some geographic areas or some populations that are particularly at risk or particularly vulnerable or affected. And so you might be setting up your registry particularly to look at that question. And we've been in discussions with a couple of countries about how that might. And then and the next question is whether our registry is really the right way to do this. And you might expect me as a sort of registry believer to say that it is, but actually I think registries tend to go on for a long time, and they're fairly inflexible. And so you may be better to set up a cohort study that is designed specifically to address your question. It runs for the particular length that you need it to answer that question, then it ends, and then you run another study perhaps. Or if it's more about intervention, it may be that you run a trial. And you should also ask if the data already exists. So the increasingly electronic health records or insurance claims will have data, and so if your question is perhaps around dialysis treatment rates, it may be that claims data will give you those numbers, maybe not quite as easily, but with a little bit of work you'll get those data from an existing database. Are they of good enough quality, the data that exist elsewhere? That's an important question. And then can you get at them? So will your government or your ministry allow you access? Will the insurance company allow you access to the data? So I think working through those things, because if the data exists and they're good quality and you can get access to them somehow, really you shouldn't be trying to set up, it's almost unethical to set up more data flowing, more data processing if the data already exists. And then I think the other third and final question at this stage is it feasible? And key considerations relate really to funding here, and it's obviously going to be something that everybody thinks about in setting up a registry. There are a range of different sources that you can go to for funding in the repository that we'll show you a little bit later on. You can click on the map and you can look at different registries around the world, and we've tabulated the different funding models that they use for funding their registries. In the UK, we ask kidney units to pay for every patient that's on dialysis. They pay us about £25 a year for us to collect their data and to provide the quality assurance mechanism. And that's a great model. It's very sustainable, and it comes out of the money that we get paid by the government for providing dialysis. But there's a whole lot of different models for funding dialysis. And I think not that you need to work out the total costs of your registry at this stage, but it's useful to have an idea who might be the funder, because when we go into the next step, involving that funder early gives them a say in the design of your registry and allows them to feel part of it. They may be more likely to give you the money that you need or support you in the way that you need. So that's really the key thing, I think. Those are the three questions, just in terms of asking whether a registry is feasible. And second step is really to establish your team, so that you almost did that first little exercise on your own, or perhaps with one or two other people who are passionate about answering the question or achieving the objective. Really, the next step is to establish a wider team of experts and stakeholders, and that will be obviously clinicians, in our case kidney doctors and perhaps kidney nurses, but also patient representatives, partly because they understand the subject matter, partly because you might be asking them to provide patient-reported data, quality of life data, but also in terms of governance, which we'll come to later, it's very reassuring to ethics committees and the legal advisors if you have involved patients in the planning of your registry and the way that you process your data. It's good to have an epidemiologist or a biostatistician, perhaps even a health economist in that group at this planning stage, database expertise, legal and data privacy expertise. Project management, I think, is really important because these are complex things to deliver, and you need to have someone who is able to phone people up and press them for the bit of information that we're waiting for that's holding everything else up to keep things moving along. And I think at this stage, you also want to include some stakeholders because, again, they'll be really important. Patients can be really strong advocates for treatments and for registries in all settings. And so involving patients can be a great way to persuade policymakers and government officials that your initiative is important. But all of those people in the list there could be stakeholders depending on the relations within your country. And the sooner you involve them, the more they feel part of it, and the more buy-in you'll get for a sustainable registry. So then with that advisory committee, you tackle the sort of 6 or so, what I call the sort of detail points. And I think it's best to do this with that expertise on board rather than just on your own. But there's now a series of 6 things which can all happen in parallel, but should involve the range of experts that we looked at a moment ago. So you had your initial brainstorming with yourself about what the goal of your registry might be, what the objectives might be, but you really need to nail those down, involve those other people in setting those goals, setting those objectives, because they will underpin everything. As you'll see in a minute, they'll underpin your choice of data items, they'll underpin the way you collect the data and all of that, the way you design the sampling and so on. You need to decide on your target population. Is it hemodialysis patients, peritoneal dialysis patients, people with IgA nephropathy, people with membranous nephropathy? It'll depend on your goal and your objectives. Think about this is getting into the science a little bit and having a research hat on, even though this may not be for research. But thinking about your exposure, for example, might be dialysis. Outcomes, we have a couple of examples there on the right-hand side, but so the exposure might be immunosuppression therapy, the outcome might be kidney transplant rejection, and then you might be looking for confounders. What confounders would you want if you were looking to see how immunosuppression was associated with rejection? And we've got a couple of potential confounders there that you might wish to include in your data set. And those would be trying to address that objective of whether kidney transplant rejection rates vary according to immunosuppression rate. You've got to decide on data collection frequency. So for example, are you going to try and expect people to register patients as they become eligible throughout the year, or every quarter, or just once a year? There are problems with anything that's not continuous, because people might die between your census dates and may get dropped out of the registry, missed from the registry, so you don't have a full picture, you just get a group of survivors. But also the follow-up frequency. If you've included everybody in your data collection or your screening, then it doesn't matter quite so much how often you follow them up. You can follow them up once a year, so long as you capture the dates of events. So if they die during the year, you capture the date of that death. It doesn't matter if you get the date at the end of the year or during the year. That is less important. The key thing is making sure you capture everybody who became eligible for your registry. Size and duration may or may not be important depending on the goals and objectives. And create a bit of a model. It sounds a bit dry and dull, but registries can become very complex things with data flowing, and sometimes just drawing a picture of how you determine eligibility, how patients flow within the registry. Is data anonymized or pseudonymized or encrypted, and those sorts of things. Putting it down on paper really focuses your mind and is a good exercise and makes it clear for other people. At this planning stage, it's really important to think about bias, and this is where I think the temptation often just to, well, so long as we include a lot of people, it doesn't matter if we've included everybody. But in a registry, one of the big advantages of registries is that they're representative of the population that you're trying to describe. And if you end up just recruiting people, let's say from a tertiary academic kidney unit, then you will not be able to describe all of the people having kidney failure in your country, and the survival and the outcomes will not be representative of all of the country. And that's the external validity element of bias here. So you want to make sure that the way you design your data capture is provides a sample that is representative of all kidney patients in your region or in your country. Internal validity is about the quality of the data. So have you, and if you're looking at describing an association, have you measured the confounders? Can you say that association is real after adjusting, is independent after adjusting for factors that we know might determine, let's say, survival, so age and comorbidity and so on. So if it's internally valid, you've got good data on those confounders, and your data on the exposure and outcome is reliable and robust. External validity is about, does your sample represent the wider population? So moving on to the data set, and quality over quantity is this sort of the buzzwords here. So people are often tempted to try and collect as much data as possible, and they're always tempted to, oh, it'd be great, it'd be really interesting if we could have this data element. But being very, very strict, the guys amongst you that are part of the AFRAN Renal Registry will know how Rosine has sort of cut back the data set down to a bare minimum of things that will allow you to report incidence rates and prevalence rates and survival rates. And one or two other things, maybe you'll add in some other variables if they're particularly important in your country. Stakeholders consider them important, you might add them in. But you want to get the data set down to a minimum. And at every stage, you should be sort of being very careful and having an eye on data privacy. And then go out and test those data elements. So do the definitions that you write down, do they make sense to the people collecting the data? Does everybody think the same thing when they see that definition? So is everybody interpreting diabetes, for example, as the same thing, or hypertension as the same thing? It sounds astonishing that they wouldn't be, but it's amazing how people will interpret things, and suddenly you realize that hypertensive kidney disease doesn't mean the same in one person's mind than another. And then piloting the data, the data entries as well. Data can come from a number of different sources, primary data sources, so case report forms, which can be paper or electronic or a website, or extraction. So in the UK Renal Registry, we extract our data from electronic health records in every kidney unit. There's a little program that sits in every kidney unit's computer program, and it draws out the fields that we have agreed we will extract. And every quarter we get that data without anybody having to type it in or transfer it across. So it's a great model, but it has disadvantages as well. But you need to think about those things. Maybe you haven't got electronic health records everywhere to extract it from, and certainly the quicker and easier thing to set up is case report forms, either on paper or or a website. If the internet's not great, then sort of spreadsheets that can be mailed back and go straight into a database. Secondary data sources are big national electronic health records, if they exist, or administrative databases. Death registers, for example. So again, Prof. Davids in South Africa recently linked his South African Renal Registry to the MRC death register for survival, the first survival analysis of the South African Renal Registry. And it was felt to be, it certainly provided us with some deaths that were not recorded in the registry. And so it's a useful thing to do to provide reliable and robust results for even a simple analysis like survival. And existing registries, maybe there's a PD registry, maybe there's a transplant registry. If you can link into those other registries, or if you're a PD registry, you might be able to link into an HT registry and get some of your fields without you having to collect the data again. I haven't really said a lot about management, but there's a lot to consider in terms of physical securities and firewalls and so on when you're hosting your database somewhere, and that's something to consider. Which links onto this, because this is your actual database when you're choosing it, and there's 3 options that you have. You can buy a database off the shelf. So again, not particularly buying it, but taking one off the shelf in the sort of AFRAN registry. You're taking the South African Renal Registry off the shelf, and there's a little bit of adaptation to be relevant to the countries or the ethnic groups in the country. But generally, there's an existing database or existing package which works in one country, and with minor adaptation, you can bring it across to your country. If you want to be more adventurous, really adventurous, you can build one yourself in-house, or you can, but you need a lot of technical expertise, you need a lot of capacity. We've been trying to do that. We tried to do that in the UK Renal Registry for most of the 6 years that I was medical director, and it was a very, very difficult process, much more difficult than we imagined it was going to be. But I think we learned a lot of lessons, and I think it's the right thing to do sometimes. But both of those build solutions require a lot of knowledge and project management and IT people being willing to challenge each other about timelines that are realistic. And so I think realistically, you're looking for an off-the-shelf solution, and maybe taking one from a country that's running a simple registry like the one you envisage would be the way forward. The short thing to say about legal, ethical, privacy, and security issues is that it will be different depending on which country you're based in. And there are 2 very long chapters. The chapter in the North American guidance document is incredibly long on this issue, but most of it is irrelevant unless you want to set up a renal registry in the USA. But there are some basic principles. Do you need patient consent? And if so, is it opt-in or opt-out consent? Or can you get a waiver of consent by going through some legal channels? And that's what we have in the UK. We have a lawful basis to collect data, and the Department of Health gives us that lawful basis to collect data without individual consent, which has a big advantage because it means people who die in the first couple of weeks of dialysis, they don't get omitted from the registry. You don't have to survive, be well enough to get a consent form signed to be included in the registry. So we will have everyone included, fit or sick or about to die, they'll get registered, and we can provide reliable descriptions of outcomes in everyone who started dialysis. So there are big advantages. And you can use different ways to protect privacy. Pseudonymization is where you separate out the identifiable information from the clinical data, and you apply a key, a sort of a unique study number, which nobody can link to that individual unless they have the key. And so you keep the key linked to the identifiable information somewhere separate, and then all of the sensitive clinical data is stored in a database with just that study number and the clinical data. You might still want to encrypt it at rest in the dataset, but also on transfer. Anonymization is not a great idea because although it gets you past a lot of the privacy laws if it's anonymized, it means you can't really do very much. You certainly can't follow people up, and you can't link to their other data. And even aggregating data, so providing summary statistics in tabular form is challenging because sometimes if it's small numbers and cells, it's considered identifiable. I noticed there's something in the chat. I can't see the chat myself, so if anybody wants to interject, if it's an important message in the chat, please do so. Last in this details section is governance, and it goes without saying that leadership is important in running a registry, and having an individual who's really passionate and motivated to run the registry is vital. But they also need to have a steering committee with them, or it might be an executive committee that runs the registry. You will still need advisory committees. So, for example, you might have an advisory committee for running the research aspect, or you might have an advisory committee for running the reports, the annual reports, and the progression of the annual reports. So for operational tasks like that, you might have subcommittees that advise the executive committee or the steering committee, which will just sort of divide out the work depending on the size of your registry. Also really useful, especially when you're starting out or trying to evolve, is an external advisory committee, so an expert committee. There might be registry folk within your country, diabetes registers or cardiovascular registers or cancer registers in your country, or it might be people running renal registries in other countries. So I think that's good. They don't have to meet very often, but they can meet once a year. You can report to them. They can give you their really wise advice, and then they go away, and you can decide whether you like their advice or you completely ignore it. But it's just a fresh outside pair of eyes to sort of guide you, to give you a fresh perspective, to make you stop and think once a year, how are we doing? What did we say we do this time last year? What have we done in the last year? It's a good forcing function in that way. And then there's a couple of tips there just around how to provide good governance. I think the key thing probably in all of that is documentation. So you need to document what you're doing. It needs to be transparent, and people, patients, and ethics committees and so on will want to see that you're public about the way you describe how you handle data and what you do with the data. So having done all of that detail, that was a big step. All of those things were about detail. And once you've addressed all of those issues with your advisory committee, and you've worked out how you're going to run your registry, you put it all down into documents. So you will write a registry protocol, which will often be required for your ethics approvals, or it might be required for other things. And you'll have a bunch of standard operating procedures which report how data is handled, perhaps, or how databases are backed up, and all of those operational issues. And they're important, because if they're just in your head, then the whole thing isn't sustainable. You can't retrain everybody out of your head every time a new person joins a department. It's got to be written down. People have to be able to pick this up, read through those documents, and know how your registry runs. And so, although documentation sounds like a lot of work, it's vital for making your registry sustainable. And I think one of the things we'd like to do is sort of share SOPs across registries, so that you can see what these look like in running registries, and you can go to copy and paste across things that work in other registries. And I think you probably, to take all of those things, those details you've worked out with your advisory committee, to take those into an actual successful running registry, you need a project plan, because it's going to be a complex project, and having somebody with project management expertise and experience with IT, for example, will help you deliver your registry more quickly than if it's just you on your own. So I think developing a project plan is really worthwhile. So just to take you back, that's what it looks like. So you assess feasibility and appropriateness of setting up a registry. You build your advisory group, and then you work through the detail, all of those things that we talked through. You consider each aspect of detail and agree the fine points. Once you've got all of that agreed, then you move on to delivery, with documenting with your protocol, documenting with your SOPs, and then coming up with your project plan. And beyond that, we haven't done the work yet, but there's a whole bunch of chapters that we will be writing to help maintain your registry and evolve your registry, and decide when you no longer need a registry. I think that's important. So what will it look like? So those of you who visit the ISN website will I think, recognize this from the ISN Act toolkit. So I've mocked this up to show what the ISN Share RR toolkit might look like. And so you would click here. We've clicked on the details tab, and we've got we've clicked on the feasibility tab, and we've got these are the 3 questions I took you through earlier. If you click on one of the pluses there, it will expand and you'll be able to read the guidance text that sits under that, and then you could collapse it down and click on another plus to read. So it's a sort of accessible way, hopefully, of working your way through those steps, and then with links through to those big guidance documents, so that you don't have to read through all 426 pages of the AHRQ document. You can go, I need to go to chapter 3.6 because I'm really interested today. I'm really interested in, I don't know, getting ethics approval. We're also working with a really nice infographics person at ISN. So we're making some nice infographics that sort of summarize some of the rather dry details that there are in these big documents. Maria has been using the survey data that I mentioned earlier and putting it into a web sort of searchable web map thing. So you can click on so if you type that you want paper CRFs and you want hemodialysis in adults using consent, taking consent, you can use those filters, and it will show you the registries around the world that are using collecting data in that way. You can click on them, and a little table pops up with a table of their some of their key characteristics and a link to the person at that registry that's happy to be contacted for advice. And Maria can talk to you more about that if you're interested. We're going to run some more workshops, but all of these workshops will be underpinned by the toolkit I've just described and those AHRQ and parent documents. And so all of our educational material will use the ISN Academy as well for some training programs. But there'll be an in-person webinar at future WCNs. There'll be stuff through ISN Academy, but it'll all be underpinned by this ISN Share Our Toolkit. And we'll set up a network of registry experts. So a community worldwide of people who are interested and passionate about registries, who will mentor and support and sit on your external advisory committees and that sort of thing. And I think that's slightly softer thing that we can offer, but I think it's really, really important. So in summary, ShareR, it's being set up to guide and signpost, provide education, provide a network and some tools and resources to help people establish registries in countries that don't have them. Once it's launched, then we will use it to work with individuals in different countries and help them to work with their national societies and their governments to sort of set up registry. We haven't got that model working yet. We've tried it with a couple of countries. We've got some checklists that we work through, but how do we sit down with a nephrologist in a country and help him or her through the process of setting up a registry? But again, I see that as being underpinned by the toolkit and those steps that we've just talked through. Really importantly, and Shari Malik, the Executive Director of ISN, is very keen that I mention this every time I talk about ShareR, and I'm keen as well as the Treasurer of ISN. There are no plans for ISN to fund individual registries, so we're not anticipating, funding registries, or even we don't see ISN being a global register. The ISN registry, like the ERA registry, there are no plans for that. Although we may be able to sort of put registries in touch with each other and do collaborative research projects, sharing data, or, collaborating to write international collaborative projects together. But there are no plans. It would be a huge undertaking to do that. And the USRDS international chapter, of course, already covers this pretty well. And that's, often cited when people are. So I think that's all I was going to say. Just a final slide to acknowledge the advisory group. So we now, as well as the 5 I mentioned earlier, we now have a 6th in the Japanese renal dialysis registry, So we have two representatives from the Far East, 2 from the Middle, and 2 from the Far West. And they're big established registries with a lot of experience, but they don't generally have a lot of experience in setting up a registry in a lower middle income setting. So I think that's where I'm really keen to get some feedback from you guys today about, how this would be useful to you, and how we might adapt it. I've got some emails on there. So Maria's on the call. She's a Share R fellow and a postdoc here with me in Bristol. Paul Laffin is the advocacy lead as ISN. And then we've got some emerging leaders. So I don't know if Elliot's on the call, but Elliot has worked with us on a number of things, and others as well from other parts of the globe. I think that's my last slide. Yeah. So it was a bit of a. I see Elliot on the call, so hi Elliot. But yeah, that was a bit of a long monologue from me. I hope it was interesting to kidney doctors and non-kidney doctors.
Thank you so much.
Yes, nice presentation.
Yes, thank you so very much, giving us a very good overview of what a registry is about and how to go about it and what it actually entails when one goes into a registry. So I think I'll open the floor to questions. Any questions? Dr. Elliott, I think you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to congratulate Fergus on the wonderful presentation and to respond to his hello.
Hi, Elliot. I nearly made a joke about you're always at every meeting I go to. I don't know how you managed to do it, but yeah, no, great to hear from you. And I noticed a comment from Dr. Murali, just a slightly tongue-in-cheek comment, but running a registry seems more difficult than managing a patient. I think, I guess that is a comment and feedback that I have had when I've presented this before. And I guess I'm nervous. It's a difficult balance to strike because on the one hand, setting up a registry is a big undertaking, and so people should not try and undertake it lightly. If you do, you'll end up with a sort of a lot of patients, but what can you say about those patients, because they don't represent all the patients? You might have a selected group of people. So from an epidemiological, even from a service planning point of view, it's pretty meaningless. But it depends on your purpose. That kind of very selected registry might be fine if you're looking at a treatment. So if you're looking at rituximab for membranous GN or eculizumab for atypical hemolytic uremic syndrome or whatever it is. So I don't know. Maybe it is slightly daunting when you run through it like that. I think that's where I suppose we would hope that our supportive system that we set up. So when we work out how to support people in countries, that's when I think working through those steps, we've covered it in about 45 minutes. But actually, it's intended to take years to do this. A lot of it you can copy and paste across from other registries, which is why I think Maria's map and the links to other registries, we will have resources, so people will share their protocols, they'll share their data dictionaries and so on. So I think it will be. I think it's using. Learning from each other, sharing with each other, so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel each time that you try and set up a registry. But it is a big undertaking, so I kind of don't apologize too much for sort of setting out all those steps. Goodness me, how much does it cost roughly to establish a registry? Yeah, I mean, well, you might be best to ask. I don't know whether Elliot or Jonathan know from their settings. I think I could tell you what it costs to run the UK Renal Registry every year, but you'll probably all have a heart attack. And the model is very, very different, I think. I think the model, so using the the South African Renal Registry platform and taking it into a country is a much less expensive model. It relies an awful lot on goodwill, as Elliot and Jonathan will vouch for, but and I think one of the things that I mentioned, I don't know actually if I remember to say it, but doing, piloting it with very little funding. So maybe you don't need all that funding right at the beginning. You might try and do it on goodwill, try and do it on a little bit of pump priming funding, but do that pilot, do it in a couple of centers, get some data, and then you can persuade your government that it's a useful exercise to do. So I think you don't necessarily have to get all of those funds right at the beginning. You might you start with a little bit of money. So we're working with a colleague in Sri Lanka at the moment. He's going to start it off in 2 or 3 kidney units in Sri Lanka, involving the ministry at the very beginning, just so that they're aware of plans and can input into it. And then we'll hope that perhaps the ministry will fund that in the medium to longer term. So I think there are clever ways to, rather than take one huge step right at the very beginning, perhaps taking a series of smaller steps is more realistic.
And maybe I can comment a bit, Professor. This is Jonathan Wala. Indeed, the comment about it being a daunting task, it's not exaggeration, because when you started a Renal Registry here in Kenya, the Kenya Renal Association, first of all, about the funding, Kenya Renal Association managed to give $2,500 for the initial setup of a pilot program. Obviously, that was quite a small amount. Already the software was costing almost that amount. We managed to get from pharma software that was malleable, so that we could mold it according to what we wanted to do. So the second problem was agreeing on what data we're going to collect, basically the data set and the domains that we're going to collect. The patient population is already quite wide. Is it dialysis patients? Is it chronic kidney disease patients? Is it transplant patients? And obviously everybody had their own ideas. Eventually we settled to a minimum of hemodialysis patients only, chronic hemodialysis, so that you can get data on that. The data set itself caused many problems. It became too big. We tried to narrow it down. Some individuals feel this is too little, you are covering, etc. But I followed Professor Razin's advice about the fact that quality is more important than quantity. Therefore, we try to minimize it as much as possible. Still, it ended up being laborious. The third problem that we had was, now once we piloted it, we realized there were many problems with the software that we are using, and therefore we had to get more funding to a tune of almost $5,000 to get an IT specialist to set up a new software. And I think from your talk, I've realized several mistakes we made. Maybe we should have just adopted this a platform that another registry was using. It would have been much cheaper and maybe more straightforward. We had problems with the IT person. They don't understand what exactly you're looking for, etc. The other problem we had now was once we had the software up and running, was the personnel to collect the data, because it was a primary data source. You don't have any electronic health records in Kenya, and therefore that proved a very big challenge. We have to individually visit dialysis units. They are not uniformly recording what you want to get. There are problems with the data administrators putting in data. So if an HB or hemoglobin levels of 30 have been put in instead of 3.0, you're not sure whether it's the correct one. So cleaning up the data became very difficult. And finally, we had a problem with data protection, where now some units, especially the private units, began questioning this data. What are you going to use it for? How are you going to anonymize? Just learned from me, the pseudo-anonymization might have been a better way of doing it. Where are you going to store it? Who is owning the data? All those questions that raised up. And therefore, from your talk, I've learned quite many things, many flaws that we have had with our renal registries, and I'm glad that you have been able to attend to the talk. The last one was obviously this main stakeholder for each dialysis unit. In Kenya, there is a national insurance, health insurance scheme that covers for dialysis. I'm sure that's the same thing in Tanzania and several other African countries. And it's difficult. It has been quite difficult to convince the policymakers and the funders themselves of dialysis that they are the ones who are going to benefit most from a registry. It's somehow they don't link the registry being a measure of the output of whatever they are putting in terms of money, whether they're getting any cost effectiveness. I don't know whether there is any good way of going around a politician or a bureaucrat not understanding why a renal registry should be set up. Thank you very much.
Oh, great! I mean, great to hear the real life experiences of setting up a registry in Kenya, Jonathan. I guess the one. I mean, I think there is a gradual. So ISN is speaking to politicians. So I had an email from Paul Laffin just yesterday or this morning. He'd been. I can't remember where he was, but he'd been with an Ethiopian politician, and he'd done the share our pitch. He was talking about other stuff, but he mentioned the registry stuff, and they were really interested. And so that conversation from Paul with a politician from Ethiopia is going to lead to a series of conversations, he and I and that politician. We'll try and find somebody in Ethiopia who might be interested to see if there is a nephrologist there who would really want to drive this forward. So I think, you know, and with WHO, if we can get this onto the WHO agenda, it kind of gives it an element of a seal of approval. The politicians may take registries more seriously. The other, so I mentioned SLAN, the South and Latin American group earlier. Somehow they have been much more effective working with PAHO, their equivalent of WHO, to persuade PAHO of the importance of registries and then get governments bought into to renal registries. And so I think we've got something to learn from SLAN, how they've done that, how they've worked with PAHO to get registries accepted and recommended by PAHO. And I think almost every country in Southern Latin America now has a renal registry.
One of the issues is, supposing we do collect data, let's say in East Africa, how do we work with the AFRAN registries? The issue is also we need to have permission locally to actually share that data, but the privacy issue comes up. So that was one of the problems that we faced when we actually had data that we could share.
Yeah, I don't know, Elliot, do you want to talk about how you've got around that in Nigeria?
Okay, this is Jonathan again. Maybe I could share our experience with sharing data with them in the AFRAN registry.
Yeah.
Basically, what has been expected of us is to have a particular data, like the number of dialysis patients, basically very basic data that does not involve any patient identifiers. And then there's a platform that you feed it in, and then you have your data. And therefore, it has made it quite simple. So that I'm sure, I'm not sure about the ethics of all the units, but for most of us here in Kenya, it's allowable to share laboratory reports, number of patients at dialysis unit, etc. That does not involve actually collecting the data that might identify a particular patient, for example, HIV patients, hepatitis B, etc. I think that's what we've been doing.
Thank you, Jonathan.
So certainly for share, I guess there's a question of where the data sits. So if the data sits, so if Prof. David gives you a sort of a version of the AFRAN registry data set that sits, I don't know where you are at the moment, Lloyd, but let's say it sits in Rwanda and you are, the data doesn't leave the country, that's obviously that's different. And but then you can provide the summary data, the anonymized data to the AFRAN registry for them to include in a report. So I guess that's one way around the challenge of whether identifiable data needs to leave the country and whether the law would allow that. In general, though, you just have to speak to the legal experts in the country and find the way around the particular law in your country. And you do have to do that, because although you might get away with it initially in one or two centres, particularly the private dialysis companies, once they so the big international ones, they will pick up on this very quickly and will ask you difficult questions. Unless you've covered all your bases and you've got the permissions from the right people, you won't get the data from the sort of the private company.
Which actually is quite a bit of an eye-opener. I'm sure we could actually talk further on that as well. This was a wonderful session indeed, and I think we certainly would call on for some expert advice as we go along the way, Fergus. Thank you so much for this wonderful session.
Great, thanks Lloyd, thanks Jonathan for the invitation.
Thank you very much. Yeah.